Dark dealing in the Tory leadership fight. Gove abandons Boris, declares he's running, and Boris bites the dust.
Having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
Good evening. Amid the whirlwind that has sent Westminster politics into a blood-curdling tailspin, the brutal viciousness whipped up by the historic vote to leave Europe has stirred such political venom that it has even gobbled up its very own hero, Boris Johnson. The devil in the detail is Michael Gove, once Johnson's campaign manager, now a challenger for Prime Minister himself. Into this mayhem steps Home Secretary Theresa May, casting herself as the unifying candidate of the centre. But in the real world, the Bank of England governor warns cuts in interest rates are coming. The UK needs an urgent stimulus.
So here's what actually happened in a bizarre day here in Westminster of Conservative intrigue and infighting that again took most people by surprise as the clock ticked towards that midday deadline for nominations. At 9 o'clock, Michael Gove released a statement saying he was going to stand because he'd concluded that Boris Johnson could not provide leadership for the task ahead. Then, with some devastating attack lines on Boris Johnson herself, Theresa May announced her bid.
My pitch is very simple. I'm Theresa May and I think I'm the best person to be Prime Minister of this country.
Mr Johnson, ever the entertainer, played with his audience before making them gasp with a surprise withdrawal. Along the way, Andrea Leadsom and Liam Fox, both Leave campaigners, announced they were running too, before Michael Gove finally appeared on camera to explain his shock change of heart.
And I came, as I say, reluctantly but firmly to the conclusion that while Boris has many talents and attributes, he wasn't capable of building that team. And there were a number of people who had said to me during the course of the week, Michael, it should be you.
It was also due to be a seismic day in the Labour Party, but while there were more calls on Jeremy Corbyn to quit, those MPs trying to get rid of him mostly deferred their plans. Angela Eagle is still expected to announce she's running for leader, but not today. While at the launch of a report into Labour anti-Semitism, Mr Corbyn was accused of equating Israel with Islamic State militants and failing to do anything when a Jewish Labour MP walked out after being verbally attacked by an activist.
Also on the programme tonight, he's bold, he's brash, in trouble with the law, but his party currently leads opinion polls. We speak with Geert Wilders, the controversial leader of Holland's Freedom Party, where shockwaves of Brexit are being strongly felt.
This is the chance for the Dutch people to vote also for the regaining of national sovereignty, to vote for independence of Brussels.
So it was meant to be the day when the battle lines were drawn in the Tory war of succession between Theresa May and Boris Johnson. But as so often in this bewildering last 7 days, nothing went to plan. The Justice Secretary, Michael Gove, who'd been expected to be Johnson's campaign manager, announced over breakfast he'd decided to stand himself. The move destabilised his erstwhile Leave colleague to such an extent that, by the noon deadline for nominations, he'd dramatically pulled out of the race. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports on a day when the Brexit whirlwind claimed another political career.
His career has been one big scrum of cameras, but today Boris Johnson wanted to avoid them.
Boris, has Michael Gove betrayed you? Hello. Has Michael Gove, your friend, let you down? Come on. He says he doesn't trust you. How do you feel about that? Come on, let's have it. Come here.
Round the front, MPs turned up for what they still thought was a leadership campaign launch. The word was reaching them that the campaign manager, Michael Gove, had decided Boris Johnson wasn't up to the job, and he'd decided to run himself.
It looks as though this sort of happened as a result of a slightly shabby argument over who's going to do what job.
With Michael Gove stealing his support, Boris Johnson didn't have enough MPs backing. The clue came early with a quotation from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a speech by Brutus.
But as a moment for hope and ambition for Britain. A time not to fight against the tide of history, but to take that tide at the flood and sail on to fortune.
And then this.
To stand tall in the world. That is the agenda for the next Prime Minister of this country. But I must tell you, My friends, you who have waited faithfully for the punchline of this speech, that having consulted colleagues and in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
His brother and fellow
role-
MP Joe looked on,
My role
their
will be to
dream
give every
candidate's
possible
ambition
support
now
to
checked.
the Britain. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
That wasn't what you were expecting, was it?
No, obviously not.
Did your jaw drop?
Yes.
Ever felt you were in a Greek tragedy?
Was it tragedy or farce? I don't know.
Been visited on the nation by the Conservative Party either way, hasn't it?
No, it hasn't actually.
Is that a great loss for the country, gentlemen?
Yes.
And who do you blame?
I don't know about that.
Michael Gove, his kind of old friend, do you think you let him down? Did you betray him?
Ask Michael.
And this is how Boris Johnson's former campaign manager explained his decision.
Boris is an amazing and an impressive person. But I've realised in the last few days that Boris isn't capable of building that team and providing that unity. And so I came reluctantly but firmly to the conclusion that as someone who had argued from the beginning that we should leave the European Union, and as someone who wanted to ensure that a bold, positive vision for our future was implemented, that I had to stand for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And there were a number of people who had said to me during the course of the week, Michael, it should be you. I reflected on those comments. I reflected on the individuals who'd made that case. And I came last night, as I say, with a degree of hesitation, but ultimately believing that this was absolutely the right thing to do. I came to the conclusion that it was necessary to put myself forward.
They'd been brothers in battle on the campaign trail. Last night at a Tory fundraising dinner in West London, they had their arms around each other. Some in the Johnson campaign say they'd had some suspicions about Michael Gove, but he'd long said he wasn't made of the right stuff to be Prime Minister.
The one thing I can tell you is that there are lots of talented people who could be Prime Minister after David Cameron, but count me out.
Theresa May's leadership launch is a much more orderly affair. Her supporters sell her as a serious person for serious times.
I grew up the daughter of a local vicar and the granddaughter of a regimental sergeant major. Public service has been a part of who I am for as long as I can remember. And I know I'm not a showy politician. I don't tour the television studios. I don't gossip about people over lunch. I don't go drinking in Parliament's bars. I don't often wear my heart on my sleeve. I just get on with the job in front of me.
The Home Secretary said she would be a tough negotiator, not least on immigration controls. Some worry that this contest could now see even more hardline messaging on immigration.
One of the strengths, I think, of Boris Johnson's campaign was to try and dampen down some of those expectations, whereas I think what will now happen is that expectations will be raised about what can be achieved.
But will not be satisfied. All those people who talk about pulling up the drawbridge, closing the door.
Gary, you're right. I think it's very difficult to see how that would be satisfied.
The leader of the Scottish Conservatives, no fan, was asked what she thought about Boris Johnson's bad day.
Well, leadership's not for everyone. Some people just haven't got it. Maybe he's one of them. Were you surprised by Michael Gove?
He'd been accused of putting his ambition before the national interest, but his hopes were dashed on the same day the Governor of the Bank of England tried to assess the economic consequences of Brexit.
And Gary is with me here. What actually happened here with Michael Gove and Boris Johnson?
You're getting two very different accounts from both sides, I have to say. On the Boris Johnson side, they talk about how they had their suspicions. This might have been going through Michael Gove's mind all the time. He always intended to wield the dagger. Michael Gove's people are saying actually he just grew a little bit disenchanted and heard more and more pressure in his own ear to make the stand himself. What we do know is that they don't go back an incredibly long way together. They were getting to know each other during that campaign. Michael Gove's main loyalty in the past had always been to George Osborne, so it wasn't like he'd always been in this camp, but he seems to have decided last night, we think, maybe just after he'd had his arm round Boris Johnson at that gala fundraising dinner that the Tories were throwing, decided sometime late last night that actually he was going to go for it himself.
Theresa May has come through today as the grown-up, but there was a poll that was only just released showing that she was ahead of Boris Johnson with the party. Would she be ahead of Michael Gove?
So that's the absolute key thing here. The electorate, once the two names leave the House of Commons, once they've whittled it down to 2 names, go to the party members. And she has been ahead, you're right, it was really quite ahead of Boris Johnson, one of the things that may have influenced Michael Gove's decision. But if you put Michael Gove's name to the members, some polls, now some of these could be argued as self-selecting and not really very scientific, some polls suggest he shoots right to the top. So it could, if it does come down to those people, it is quite hard to call, but you can't be sure Michael Gove makes it out of here.
So just remind us what happens now.
They're going to whittle it down to 2 names out of the 5 contenders. We haven't mentioned some of the others. Andrea Leadsom, who was on the Leave side, Liam Fox on the Leave side, Stephen Crabb, of course, we saw his declaration yesterday. One of the things Michael Gove was complaining about to the Boris Johnson camp was that they hadn't offered Andrea Leadsom a job, and the job supposedly he was trying to get for her was EU negotiator. Boris Johnson camp say, actually, sorry, Michael, that's the job that you said you wanted and that we'd already given you, along with Chancellor. So the trading, this has really lifted a lid on that's gone on. They say there hasn't been any other trading, but do you believe that?
Thanks, Gary. Well, if the scale and speed of today's developments has stunned Conservative MPs here, what on earth are the voters making of it? We've been to the Conservative stronghold of Rushcliffe in Nottinghamshire. It's Ken Clarke's seat, and one of those which voted Remain in the referendum. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni has been speaking to Conservative voters and councillors during a busy market day in Bingham.
We've got the biggest cherries in this town today, girls.
What a difference a few little hours can make.
All right, I thought Boris would have had a pop at that job. You know what I mean? But, all right.
When they arrived at market this morning, many here assumed Boris Johnson was a front-runner for the Tory leadership. But then the shock news, he won't even be standing, but Michael Gove will.
You just heard about Boris Johnson not standing.
Well, what shall I do? Say hurrah. I'm very, very pleased.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't be better.
Why is that?
He's a sort of civilised version of Farage. And about as trustworthy.
It doesn't look to me like a Prime Minister. It's the look, the way he's got his hair on that, you know.
The affluent constituency of Rushcliffe is a Tory stronghold, but it was also one of the few areas to have voted Remain in the referendum. Betty Knox says her 4 children all voted to stay in, but much to their annoyance, she voted Leave after being persuaded by Boris Johnson. She's angry that he's now walked away from the contest.
I think he made a big stand for coming out, and now he's not back in it. I dislike him intensely because I think he knows that what he promised he couldn't bring.
There's a feeling of disbelief here, that at a time when Labour is in disarray, the Tories have created their own drama. Local party activists admit it's not what they were expecting.
It did stun me quite, I'm still stunned now by it. I'd say in terms of Michael Gove standing, absolutely.
I must admit, I'd thought of him as a little boy with owlish glasses, but he actually came over as really somebody who got something to say.
They say there's frustration among members that the party should be concentrating on negotiations with the EU. What's needed now, they say, is a leader who can unite both Leavers and Remainers.
We do need someone who can unify not just the country, not just the party, but the country.
Who is that person? Do you think it's Theresa May then?
I would have the confidence Theresa May go into room to negotiate our exit in a professional way and also to get the best for the country.
Many of the would-be candidates have used words like leadership and unity. There's a feeling here they now need to start acting on them. Darshana Soni, Channel 4 News, Bingham.
Well, I'm joined now by 3 tall men, actually. The Leader of the Commons, Chris Grayling, who has proposed Theresa May for the leadership, and by the Conservative MPs Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's backing Michael Gove, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who until this morning was backing Boris Johnson. But first, Chris Grayling, why Theresa May?
I think right now this is a big moment for our country. We've just taken a momentous decision. We are going to be leaving the European Union. It's going to be a process that needs to be handled very carefully. We need somebody who has got strong, good international experience, has been a very effective minister, who has negotiated complicated deals with other governments.
Hasn't Michael Gove done all of that?
Well,
I mean, he was on your side. It's very odd that you're not going for the guy who was on your side.
Now, you see, I think now we are all Conservatives. We're not Remainers, we're not Leavers, we're Conservatives with a job given us by the country. And the key decision now is to get the best person in place to do the job. We've got a very strong team in government, but I want the right person to forge those relationships with other leaders to make sure we do this in the right way.
I mean, while people are deciding this, why is he not the man for the job?
Well, I have every respect for Michael Gove, but I, several days ago, took a decision that I believed that Theresa May was the right person for the job, the right person to lead us into those negotiations, the right person to set a direction, and also the right person to build on the agenda that David Cameron set for the last general election, which we all believe in, we all support, about making ourselves as a Conservative Party real champions of social mobility, real champions of helping all parts of our community fulfil their potential.
Don't you think voters are going to take a very dim view of this sort of rats in a sack fighting kind of behaviour that's going on? While, you know, the Bank of England's trying to stabilise the economy, people are worried about their jobs and their homes, and house sales are falling through, and all sorts of things are going on out there in the real world, and you lot are fighting, you know, each other.
Well, I think it's good for government, good for the Conservative Party, that our members, both in Parliament and elsewhere, have a proper choice, that they have the ability to choose between a number of different options. That's what they've got.
But
We've
this
got
kind of
5
treachery
candidates.
is a sort of unedifying spectacle, isn't it? I mean, that's why Theresa May was able to look like a grown-up today.
Well, I mean, I think Theresa is a very effective minister. I think she'll be a very effective Prime Minister. I think having somebody who's experienced, consistent in the work she's done, doesn't purport to be a flashy member of Parliament but gets the job done, that's actually what the country needs.
Isn't the truth that her real strength for you is that she's got the best of avoiding a general election?
Well, the question of a general election doesn't arise.
Well, it does, because you've got a whole new agenda for government. Lots of people will be demanding a general election.
No, I think actually, given everything that's happened, I would have preferred that David Cameron had stayed. I've been very clear about that. He's taken a decision which we all respect, to leave, to move on. It would have been better had he stayed, in my view, but he chose not to. I think actually right now we need to get on with the job of sorting out the future of this country, of opening up the opportunities that will be there for us if we leave the European Union, making sure we can retain good relations with other parts of the European Union.
Complete change to our economic policy, and the people don't get a say in it.
It's about now moving ahead with the mandate they gave us last week. The people had a say
Well, that was
last
just
week.
on Europe. But now you're still working out your plans, aren't you?
Well, we now need to deliver what we promised, to deliver a stable, secure future for our country, both at taking advantage of the opportunities outside the European Union and making sure we have good relations with countries inside the European Union.
Chris Grayling, thank you very much for joining us. Kwasi Kwarteng, what do you make of Michael Gove's behaviour?
I thought Michael Gove has behaved in an extraordinary way. It reminds me of student politics. I know Jacob pursued student politics quite actively with Michael at Oxford. I think you were librarian of the Union, Michael was president. I can't remember which terms.
We didn't actually overlap.
Oh, you didn't overlap.
No, we didn't.
But the difference is
Right.
that Jacob has sort of matured from that, and I think Michael still thinks he's playing those games. I think it was extraordinary what he did, and I feel that I feel very let down.
And you feel that Boris Johnson is a great loss?
I think he is a great loss. I mean, he clearly had a huge, important role in the Vote Leave campaign. I mean, you smirk, but Vote Leave
I'm
won
not
against
smirking,
the
I'm
odds.
just grimacing in the light, don't worry.
Vote Leave won against the odds. He was the leading figure, the most well-known figure. I think people who were on that side of the debate, which I was, owe him a debt of gratitude. Michael, it appeared, was going to form an alliance with him. I thought there was a real chance of a Brexit government, potentially with Andrew Leadsom. They ended up fighting with each other and doing deals and reneging on deals. And that's why I'm supporting Theresa May now.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, Anna Soubry said this was boys mucking around, and that's why it was time for a sensible woman like Theresa May. I mean, I'm tempted to ask what your nanny would make of this.
Well, Nanny doesn't normally comment publicly on political
She just
affairs.
goes campaigning with you.
She just comes campaigning with me. I don't think that's right or fair, actually. I think Michael Gove is an exceptionally able man. I think he wanted to support Boris and decided that he couldn't. And I think people in politics are entitled to change their mind. As it happens, I would have carried on supporting Boris if he hadn't stood down, even though I'd always wanted Michael to stand. I think Michael is a superb candidate. But
So given a choice between Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, you would have chosen Boris Johnson?
Well, I'd already said I'd support Boris, so I would have stuck with that. But I think if, as a senior politician, you come to the conclusion that you've made a mistake, the right thing to do is to change your mind and say publicly, I have made a mistake. Nobody in their right mind would plot or connive to do this. It was just, as the campaign developed, Michael felt that he was the only person who could do it. And it is so important that the next leader supported Brexit, because we will not get a deal that the country will be happy with if it's done by
Do you
somebody who
agree with that,
supported Remain.
saying that the next leader has to have supported Brexit?
I think Brexit was fundamentally important, but more important were issues of trustworthiness and a sense of confidence that could inspire colleagues.
So have you decided?
And clearly,
have you decided who you're
I have.
backing
I've
then?
said I would back Theresa May.
Right.
And I think her competence and her record trumps the kind of schoolboy politics, rather undergraduate politics, that I'm afraid Michael Gove has pursued. And just to add to that, forgive me, the timing, yes, it's true, people change their minds. It seems very odd to me that he changed his mind on the very day that the nominations closed. It was an odd coincidence.
Well, people have to change their mind before the deadline. That's
And he did
inevitable.
it 3 hours before the deadline.
That's inevitable. People have to change their mind before the deadline for the close of nominations.
Doesn't it just look duplicitous to people out
No,
there?
it doesn't.
That he was prepared to fight with him during
No.
the referendum and tell people that this man would make a great Prime Minister. But then as soon as that was out of the way, knife him in the front.
But hold on, he didn't say during the referendum who would make a great Prime Minister, because everyone assumed David Cameron would carry on. He supported him for a few days and came to the conclusion that was a mistake. Politicians have to be able to change their minds. Politics doesn't work. If people say, oh, I said something a few weeks ago, I've always got to stick to it.
I'm not upset. I'm questioning the timing. There was a whole week, and he did the timing.
So you don't believe it?
3 hours. No, I don't. And the Evening Standard headline today was Gove knifes Boris in bid to be PM. Okay, it's a sensational headline.
So what do you think really happened then, if you don't believe this?
I have no idea. I don't know what happened.
You think this was a plan?
I don't know. I can't comment on it. But in terms of what you asked Jacob, how it's perceived, and perception often is reality in politics, it's clearly been perceived as a knifing, because that was the headline.
I think it's a bit difficult to be in the position of saying, I don't know what happened, but I believe it to be a plot. I don't think
No, I said it's
is
perceived as a plot.
a logical
follow-through. Perceived to be a plot.
And I wouldn't base my views on newspaper headlines, that one wants to look at the details of what has happened. And it seems to me what happens is somebody changed his mind and realised that there was the future of the country at stake. This is so important that we get the chance to elect a new leader of a party about once every 10 years. It has to be the right person. And if somebody has doubts, it is much better to change their mind now rather than to discover in a few months that they have made an error.
We must leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you
for joining us. More from here in a few minutes, but now back to John in the studio.
Well, now, amid all the concerns here about the implications of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, it is easy to forget those that have been triggered in other parts of the EU. Some talk of the threat of contagion, with other countries following Britain's example. For some, though, that's not so much a threat as a promise. Geert Wilders, the head of the far-right Dutch Party for Freedom, which is currently at the top of the opinion polls, wants an exit, or Netherlands exit, from the EU. He's been talking to our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson.
Holland will always be Holland, but the Brexit shockwaves reverberate here, there's no doubt. Just this week, in the Parliament in The Hague, they voted down by 90% a motion for the Netherlands to have a Nexit referendum, as they call it here. Okay to walk here? Asks the Freedom Party boss Geert Wilders of his ever-present armed bodyguards. He's on countless death lists. He was once banned from the UK. He's anti-Islam, he's anti-EU. And next elections in the spring, he says, he's putting Nexit firmly on the Dutch agenda.
This is the chance for the Dutch people to vote also for the regaining of national sovereignty, to vote for independence of Brussels, to vote for working together with other countries where we have an interest, but doing it on our own national decision.
Is he serious? Can't he see the economic impact it's already had in the UK?
Actually, you see even now that the stock exchange, not only in the United Kingdom, but also the pound is already gaining back a little bit about what they lost in the last few days.
Just
but
a
nevertheless,
short-term
well, not a short term in like a couple of weeks, but it could take perhaps even half a year, because people have to get used to it. You have to deal with Article 50. You have to deal by starting negotiating about new free trade agreements, both with the European Union as abroad, from India to any other country outside the European Union. So it will take some time.
Trot along the corridors of power here and you'll find the Lib Dem leader doesn't need armed bodyguards. He says Wilders is a sideshow, a noise.
Is he out of touch? Is he wrong? No, he is feeding the mood of people who are afraid. And some people are afraid, I can imagine that. But Wilders, like Mr. Farage, like Mr. Johnson, is focusing on a referendum. I'm focusing on the solution. What is the plan? And what we have learned from the populists in Great Britain, they didn't have a plan B. They didn't have a plan A.
Meer of minder?
Wilders is still under legal investigation for this rally 2 years ago when he promised to cut the numbers of Moroccans immigrating to Holland.
You've made comments about Moroccans, which means you're in trouble with the police. You've got a legal problem now. That's because you are racist.
Thank you so much. I'm not racist, and I'm always in trouble. I'm always in trouble, and let me tell you why. Because I speak the truth, and I'm not a racist. The Islam is racist. The Islamic ideology, not I, make a distinction between everything that is Islamic and is non-Islamic. I don't, they do. And I fight for freedom, and I believe that the Islamic ideology and freedom are incompatible.
The picturesque port of Volendam, Geert Wilders' heartland. A recent TV poll taken just 3 days before Brexit said 54% of the Dutch want a referendum, and Nexit, getting out of the EU, would win 48 to 43%. Other polls, of course, have disagreed. From the lovely vessels in the harbour to the waterfront architecture, you can't get more Dutch than this place. And yet we're only 20 minutes up the road from the cosmopolitan feeling of Amsterdam. But when you come here, it's not difficult to find people who'll tell you that the British have been courageous, far-sighted, heroic even, in getting out of the EU, and Holland should do the same.
The leaving of Britain is a very good example what happens if the people are not happy with Europe as it is, and the same opinion is also in Holland.
If you look at the countries that not even joined the EU, they are fine. Norway, Iceland, Switzerland.
But travel just up the road to Amsterdam and you're in a different world.
I think this is a time that people need to stick together. And if you want to break up, you should break up all of you together. So you shouldn't break up by yourself.
Everybody here in Holland loves Europe. Everybody hates the EU.
Right.
Just like in England, I think.
Time and again, people here will tell you the EU must change now and must listen.
Alex Thompson reporting. Well, now our political class may be in chaos, but the Governor of the Bank of England was determined today to send a reassuring message to business. Mark Carney said that the bank was ready to take whatever action was needed to support the economy, warning that investment and growth are likely to falter. Our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. Helia, what's the Governor really telling us?
Well, John, we are likely to expect this summer a rate cut. That is the first time in more than 7 years. The Governor said that this climate of uncertainty would lead to a deferral in business investment and spending and an increase in unemployment. And it's not just a rate cut. We also heard talk of possible increase in QE. So the full,
that's quantitative easing, chucking more money
quantitative easing. So it's the full spectrum of monetary policy easing and stimulus. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Now, in my view, and I'm not prejudging the views of other independent members of the MPC, the economic outlook has deteriorated, and some monetary policy easing will likely be required over the summer.
The markets like it?
Markets loved it. Markets love helicopter money. You know, look at the FTSE 100. It soared. And in fact, since the nadir of last Friday, it had its highest close today since August last year. A very different story for sterling, though. It plummeted again back down to $1.32. And this has a real impact on consumers at home. If you are a borrower, this is great news for your mortgage or for your loan. But if you are a saver, if you are a pensioner, it's really worrying. We are already at historically low levels, and gilt yields again fell below 1%.
Poor old Mark Carney, you can't have thought that he was coming from Canada to this. Well, what is his position?
Well, today, actually, he painted himself as the only person in the bank, the only institution who has got their job correct. They did everything right. And in fact, he said, you know, to the critics who had said their forecasts were all about Project Fear, that we'd be in a worse position right now if they hadn't done that. He, in fact, took a swipe at politicians, quoting Tim Geithner, saying that any plan was better than no plan, kind of referencing the fact that there's no strategy in Westminster. And asked whether he would be forced to resign, he simply said no, he wouldn't go.
Helia Ibrahimi. Young heart patients who were treated at Bristol's Children's Hospital were put at risk of harm because of staff shortages and a lack of skills. So finds a major review involving more than 200 families after parents raised concerns about the deaths of their children. A series of recommendations have been made, including a call for a review of paediatric intensive care units right around the country. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald has this report.
Sean Turner, aged 4, and Isabella Janu, who was just 16 months old. Both had congenital heart conditions, both underwent procedures at Bristol Children's Hospital, and both died there. Sean was treated on Ward 32. His parents say he was transferred too early from the intensive care unit and that staff failed to recognise he was deteriorating.
We were realistic. Sean was having heart surgery. He wasn't going for a knee operation. So there are risks, but it was the aftercare. It was shocking, shockingly poor. And Sean suffered, and we live with the horror of that every single day. You know, you see the frightened little face, you know, all the time looking at you with his little sad eyes, you know, so mummy help me do something. And I couldn't.
The Janus tell a similar story of Isabella's treatment on the Paediatric Intensive Care Unit, or PICU, with questions over who actually did the surgery, over whether she was given an overdose and why evidence wasn't kept.
When I witnessed quite a drop in her blood pressure, I alerted the nurse, and that specific nurse, and I remember her doing it, she turned the monitor away from me and said that I would drive myself crazy. But it appeared that myself, Dan and his mother were the only ones in the room that were actually taking note of what was happening in front of our eyes, that she was deteriorating.
Now an inquiry held following concerns raised by parents has found children were put at risk of harm because of staff shortages and pressures on beds, but it does not say that this led to their deaths.
This, of course, isn't the first time there's been an inquiry like this in Bristol. Just over 15 years ago, they published the findings of an inquiry into the deaths of children who'd undergone heart surgery here at the Bristol Royal Infirmary. Now there's another inquiry and another report, this time into cardiac services for children here at this hospital.
The inquiry has now called for a national review of paediatric intensive care units because they say the pressures here were not isolated. And while they did not find failures on the scale of the previous Bristol inquiry, they did find occasions when the care was, as they say, less good.
Well, less good is a bit of a shorthand, isn't it, for all sorts of failings that parents told us about. Things like alarms not being responded to quickly, things like medication not arriving on time, things like fluid balances not being accurately charted.
The hospital, though praised for improvements made, has now apologised to parents.
I think there were shortcomings both in our the way we were listening to the concerns of staff and then indeed the way we responded to the concerns of parents. I'm deeply sorry for that, and I'd like to say sorry to all the families where the review shows that our care fell below acceptable standards.
The Janus, the Turners and some of the other parents too are angry with the findings, and in a joint statement today they said it does not go far enough, that there was no accountability and that it left far too many questions unanswered.
Well, the expected developments over the Labour leadership failed to materialise today, but Jeremy Corbyn plunged himself into deeper difficulties at the launch of a report into tackling anti-Semitism in the party. His own comments about Israel provoked protest, and one of his MPs walked out, complaining that a Corbyn supporter had abused her. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, reports.
Early this morning, it looked like Angela Eagle would today challenge Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership.
I'll be saying something later today.
But then something happened. I'm told that when Eagle got to Westminster, she was visited by this colleague, Owen Smith, who quit on Monday as Shadow Pensions Secretary. A former broadcaster elected in 2010, Mr. Smith apparently told Eagle that he too had 51 nominations from Labour MPs, but urged they should try and agree a unity candidate. So, Eagle put her challenge on hold. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn today launched Labour's report on anti-Semitism in the party, but even he couldn't avoid the big issue.
We all know that despite the overwhelming mandate that was given by Labour Party members and supporters last year, we've all had a torrid few days. Well, at least I have.
But then his prepared speech prompted accusations he'd equated Israel with Islamic State militants.
Our Jewish friends are no more responsible for the actions of Israel or the Netanyahu government than our Muslim friends are for those various self-styled Islamic states or organisations.
Trickier still, a Jewish Labour MP, Ruth Smith, stormed out complaining a Corbyn supporter had made an anti-Semitic attack on her. In a statement afterwards, she said of Jeremy Corbyn,
"The fact that he failed to intervene is final proof for me that he is unfit to lead. I call on Jeremy Corbyn to resign immediately and make way for someone with the backbone to confront racism and anti-Semitism in our party and in the country."
Thank you very much. A sign of Corbyn's plight and dwindling support among MPs was the appearance today of left-winger Paul Flynn on Labour's front bench in the Commons.
But today, for very positive reasons, as part of a diverse...
At the age of 81, he's thought to be the oldest frontbench spokesman for any party since William Gladstone. And increasingly, Labour MPs are looking to history in wondering if, as with the breakaway Social Democrats 35 years ago, the party might split.
I think that's on the cards. I don't want to be too alarmist at this because we've got a way to go, but I think there are such divisions now, divisions between people like me, who are the Labour tradition, the mainstream Labour, and people like Jeremy Corbyn, who are on the hard left, who are not the proper Labour Party. That division is there and has become much more obvious since Corbyn became leader. And I can't see the two being reconciled because Corbyn and the hard left do not want reconciliation and unity. They want to take over. So a split may well be on the cards.
Mr. Corbyn, have you had any doubts about your leadership? Have you thought about not standing?
Oh, go away.
We may be seeing the slow, painful end, not just of an individual leader, but one of this country's historic political parties.
And Michael's here now. What on earth's going on?
Well, I think we've reached a bit of a stalemate at the moment, a stalemate which is quite likely to go on for the next few days over the weekend. The events in the Conservatives, of course, gave Angela Eagle the excuse not to hold the planned launch that she was going to make this afternoon. The real problem that the rebels have is that if they challenge Jeremy Corbyn and stand against him in a leadership election, the danger is, from their point of view, that he wins. And that makes their position a lot more difficult. So they're hoping to keep up the war of attrition. The hope today was that perhaps some of the new, younger members of the shadow cabinet, people we've never heard of, will go along to Mr. Corbyn and persuade him to call it a day, although I haven't found any evidence that that has actually occurred yet, or it may well have done so. There's also some people thinking that Mr. Corbyn is simply waiting for the Chilcot report next week and the chance to stand up and say that Tony Blair should be prosecuted for war crimes. But I think we are now at the stage where friends, allies, supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, many of them really think that he can't really last much longer. Indeed, one of his close supporters said to me tonight, if the rebels can lay siege a bit longer...
Not now, not now. I don't know who they are, but...
No.
We'll just forget about them. Sorry about that. Thanks for that, Michael. No, we'll just carry on. Now, much of the debate surrounding the EU referendum focused, of course, on immigration. But how has this discussion and the result affected the communities who have made their home here? And how do parents and teachers explain it all to children? Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has been to a primary school in Peterborough where 98% of pupils have English as a second language. Here's her report.
From across Europe and far beyond, the children of the Beaches Primary School get ready to start the day. For these families, the EU referendum result could hardly be more important. Westminster isn't the only place riven by uncertainty.
I feel scared about that, really scared, because if they tell us to go home, we have to leave everything, you know, it's not so good.
And the fact that nobody has said people who are here already will have to go home.
Yeah, but it's hard to live because we don't know what will be next, what they tell, because it's crazy things happening now.
This school represents everything that is right about immigration in the UK at the moment, or everything that's wrong about it, dependent on your point of view. 98% of the children are migrants or children of migrants. 26 different languages are spoken. And children come from every corner of the world. But this school is slap bang in the middle of a city which voted resoundingly to leave the EU. And for many of those voters, it was because of immigration. And the children and families here know that.
Denmark, Estonia, Finland.
It's maybe no surprise they also know all the countries of the European Union. Half the children here are from countries within the EU.
Sweden and the United Kingdom. Oh, does everyone fully agree with that? Okay, why do we disagree with that?
It's clear the vote out has been a big talking point at home.
Really panicking at home, because like if they leave the country, it's going to be hard for them to find a job and a place to live.
They're really worried because me and my little brother, we don't have the English passport.
Because they're from Portugal, now we might have to leave this country.
And although the politicians have said that's not going to happen, that's still something that you think has made your mum and dad nervous?
I don't know. They might be lying, they might not. We don't know if we trust them or not.
But outside the school gates, many feel immigration has put too much pressure on the city. In the past 5 years, the number of EU migrant children in schools here has risen by more than 4,000. The Beach's head teacher, Tim Smith, says the school has seen it all before.
In order to meet, to some degree, the problem of the young Italians in the school.
This an excerpt from the school log in 1963, when an influx of Italian pupils arrived. By 2004, the school was 90% Pakistani. He says the school and the city can cope this time too.
We do the best we can. We take everybody who wants a place, more or less.
But it has been a particular problem because of the spike in immigration here, hasn't it?
I think it's a spike in the enlargement of the city. It isn't just due to immigration. It's due to housing development. It's due to expansion of the city. It isn't just immigration. That is a myth.
But what will be the reality of life after leave? Certainly no one here is sure of what will happen next.
Now, police here have said the number of reported hate crimes have spiked since the referendum. 331 incidents have been reported since last Thursday, like this one on a tram in Manchester that we broadcast on our programme earlier this week, compared with the weekly average of 63 reports. Police say community tensions are on the rise, with a small number of people saying they are too scared to leave their homes.
Over the last week, the numbers of hate crimes reported nationally have increased substantially. A lot of that is just verbal abuse. Some of it is negative social media commentary. There's been anti-migrant leafleting and also a few assaults. We're also finding from the National Community Tension Team that the level of community tension is rising across the country, and people are really quite concerned. And our message is, please do not suffer in silence. Call the police, let us protect you, let us bring those offenders to justice.
And that's it from Westminster. Sorry about the earlier interruption. It wasn't a political protest or anything noble, just idiots. There's a lot of it about. Now that's John.
Well, now, we're used to a world in which the politicians are in control of events, setting the parameters within which we can all just get on with our lives. But since last week's referendum, when the people took control, the politicians have been floundering to catch up. But did it all happen because the men in charge, and they were all men, began playing power games worthy of TV fiction? Porrick O'Brien has this.
Julius Caesar, Game of Thrones, Macbeth, House of Cards.
That's right. We don't submit to terror.
Where a privileged elite graduate together, carve up countries.
We make the terror.
Tell me your favorite scene
Mr. Gove, from Game of Thrones?
My favourite character in Game of Thrones is undoubtedly Tyrion Lannister. And the moment I love most is when he leads what's apparently a hopeless charge of his troops.
Those are brave men knocking at our door. Let's go kill them!
This misshapen dwarf, reviled throughout his life, thought in the eyes of some to be a toxic figure, can at last rally a small band of loyal followers.
The question: has a posh boy parlour game turned dark? Has the British populace replaced a pig's head?
This is not a time to quail. It is not a crisis, a time not to fight against the tide of history, but to take that tide at the flood and sail on to fortune.
The Julius Caesar quote, part rallying cry, part evil-eyeing the assassin.
On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures.
What's most shocking about this is not the tragedy, it's frivolity that such little people, such shallow people, such unscrupulous people can do this to our country and get away with it. I fear, I can't prove this, I hope I'm wrong, I think we're like King Lear's England. Divided, fighting each other with no obvious future, and surrounded by Gonerils and Reagans, who all flatter the electorate. And what worries me is what happens when the peasants find out they've been lied to.
The thing about Shakespeare, you can channel any world view through the prose. The characters in today's drama, though, real world, not caricature.
Noble Cassius.
We have this sort of populist revolt against the establishment led by, well, basically the Oxford Union, and now they're all turning on each other, sort of lopping each other's heads off.
It looks mad, doesn't it? But I think what's interesting is there are different kinds of Conservatives who you're seeing fighting here. So Michael Gove has actually a very different social background to David Cameron. He was the adopted son of a fishmonger, grew up in Aberdeen, scholarship boy who got to Oxford completely to the surprise of his parents. David Cameron, obviously, to the manor born, more like Boris Johnson. But I think Gove, as a result, has always had this slightly revolutionary zeal. So he's not a sort of conserving conservative, he's a radical.
And last night, another scene in the psychodrama, with a country startled in the headlights, the Conservative summer ball.
Porrick O'Brien reporting. We join us now are the writer and columnist for the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens, the writer, Laurie Penny, and from his home in Berkshire, the author and Labour Party supporter, Robert Harris. Perhaps we'll put Labour slightly to one side, but it seems to be part of it too. How have we fallen so far, Robert?
Well, it's hard to identify any one cause. I think the pace of technological change has overwhelmed our political structures and our social structures, and we're no longer really able to cope. I don't think the old parties, the old way of doing things can respond anymore. It's broken. And I think what we've seen over the last year, and in particular over the last week, is the product of this breakdown in the old way of doing things. And something is slouching to Bethlehem to be born out of all this, and it might be quite worrying.
Well, do you subscribe to the view that the digital revolution has played a very big part in all this?
No, not really. It obviously speeds things up. But what's fundamentally wrong is that the two main parties don't reflect the divisions in this country anymore. They reflect ancient, dead divisions, and the real ones between social conservatives and social liberals particularly, and against those who wish this to be an independent country and those who prefer it to be in the European Union, were much better reflected in the referendum. And the ghosts of two new parties emerged in that referendum. You can see them almost taking shape in front of us. If only we could get rid of the two old dead corpse parties, we might actually have some real politics in this country instead of dreadful Blairite consensus that we've suffered for the past, nearly 20 years.
Laurie Penny, do you agree with that analysis?
No, I mean, honestly, what's happening at the moment in government seems to be just overgrown schoolboys playing out long-standing feuds and, unscrupulous people. They have no compunction, they lie, and they are prepared to take the entire country down with them in their struggle for power. The Game of Thrones analogy is actually quite apt, and I can't believe I'm talking with you about this, Jon Snow. But it's...
Well, I know nothing.
You know nothing, or should it be Jon Targaryen now? But anyway, Game of Thrones is a show about idiots with too much power ruining a country because they can't see the wider picture. And this is what's happening here. I think the only way the analogy breaks down is Michael Gove is certainly no Tyrion Lannister. He's not smart enough for that, I don't believe.
But Robert Harris, don't you think, in fact, it's the people that have overthrown the elite? I mean, it's the people who've not gone along with what the elite wanted, largely because quite a lot of them feel very alienated, and quite a lot of them have not had quite a share of the cherries that the rest of society has enjoyed.
I think that's true. I think that's been especially true since the financial crash, where those that seem to have caused it have become even richer and the victims have become even poorer. And I think it's that really which has focused the discontent. I would be wary of going down the line of saying that the referendum represented some healthy new form of democracy. I think that the moment politics becomes that binary, complicated issues are reduced to simple slogans on Twitter and on the side of buses. And I don't think it was a great advert for democracy. And really, I would say it's not so much that the people have taken control as the politicians have abdicated their responsibility. And by kicking that issue out into a referendum, it was really a betrayal of the very parliamentary democracy and government that I thought the Brexiteers were supposed to believe in.
Well, that is...
Don't get me wrong. I never approved of the referendum. I didn't want a referendum. What I've always wanted is particularly for the Conservative Party to collapse and be replaced by a genuine Conservative Party. One would have no objections to the Conservative Party if it campaigned as, say, the Socialist Workers' Party or something more equivalent to what it actually does. But it is, at the moment, it pretends to be a Conservative Party in a country which badly needs a Conservative Party and doesn't have one.
But is this
and the Labour Party also is not. I mean, the crucial, the binary part is this: the Labour Party doesn't love the poor, and the Tory Party doesn't love the country, and that is what they're supposed to do. We have in this country been free largely because of the strong difference between the two major parties. As Richard Neville, who said in the 60s, it was an inch of difference between the two parties. It was in that inch we all live, and an adversarial parliament is very important for freedom. The problem with our parliament at the moment is it's anything but adversarial. It's all Blairites from north to south and east to west, carpeting.
Well, I noticed neither of you have mentioned the media. I mean, what role did Rupert Murdoch and Mr. Dacre play in all this?
Well, who knows? I mean,
the Gove email seems to suggest quite a lot.
The old lesson of the media, and this has been true since probably the 1930s, when the big press barons really first got engaged, is that they can fan and amplify a genuine shift in public opinion. They can't create one. There is a real discontent here.
Is that true?
Honestly, the real tragedy here is that what was phrased and sold in many ways as a working class victory and a victory of ordinary people, well, it's not been delivered. It's been a victory for a certain subset of elites. And what we have now is an amped up version of what we had before, which is spoiled men in government and in the press arguing over what this tiny slice of power should look like. Meanwhile, you have people like those kids we saw on the news just before, those frightened kids in that school whose real lives are going to be affected by this. The people arguing about this at the top of government are not the people whose lives are going to be materially affected. They are not the people living in fear right now. And I think it is a huge betrayal by the political class, by Labour, by the Conservatives. People asked for sovereignty. We don't even know who's in charge at the moment. Labour and the Tories are too busy eating themselves to lay out any sort of plan. It is disgraceful. I'm ashamed of this country this week.
Robert Harris, from whence comes redemption?
Well, it's not necessarily easy to see it. I mean, I've written books about the fall of the Roman Republic, and the problem that happened there was that they got away from their constitution by introducing endless special measures, giving special commands and so on, and the whole system broke up. And what worries me is that you see with the
the referendum, this pushing out of power away from where the decisions should be taken. And so the country's having a nervous breakdown because it voted 52 to 48 to leave the EU, whilst the Commons is 75 to 25 to remain within it. And in the Labour Party, you've got 80% of the MPs who took part in the ballot want the leader to go, but he is being kept in power by people who paid £3 last summer in a kind of mass movement to join the party. And again, there's a breakdown between the place where our democracy is run, in the House of Commons, and outside. And in that war, you're going to get a lot of strife, which is exactly what happened in the Roman Republic.
Well, Laurie Penny, whence comes redemption?
I think at the moment the question is just how we're going to take care of each other in the meantime, and how we're going to stop pointing fingers and blaming each other. Old people blaming young people, you know, working class people blaming metropolitan elites, and negative British people blaming immigrants. It seems to be a blame game right now.
The complexity, alas, of what we're trying to deal with is so great we've run out of time. But thank you all three very warmly for coming. We'll be back tomorrow, 7 o'clock. But after another breathless day of events, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.